So back at it again with the old Tundra. If you haven't already checked out the Dirtbag Garage on Instagram or YouTube, go ahead and do that. For the builds of my own, it's Dr. Omiz. That's Dr_OMIZ. And today we are dealing with a CV axle swap. So you can see here, this is the CV axle I already took out of the passenger side. Absolutely horrible. CV boot was ripped, there was no grease in here, and the bearings are just shot and it's just super clunky. So what I was feeling was just some floating sensation and some swaying when I'm driving, and also some clunking when I'm turning side to side, going over bumps and stuff. So this is gonna make stuff feel a lot better. We're also gonna mimic this repair trail side. So assuming that you have some way to lift your truck up, everything that you need is going to be pretty simple. So what you're going to need is an impact gun. If you don't have an impact gun, breaker bar is just fine. You need a 17 millimeter socket, ratchet, and extension. Whatever size socket you need for your lug nuts, which mine is a 19 in this case. And you need a 35 millimeter socket for the axle nut, or it's 1 3/8 if you're using American. Also a screwdriver, that might be important later, I'll show you, and a pair of pliers to take out the cotter pin. So again, assuming that you have the ability to lift up your truck, get it up off the ground, and start getting those lug nuts off and pull the wheel off. So normally you would have a hubcap here, but unfortunately my truck didn't come with one. You put a flathead screwdriver behind the hubcap and you hammer that out gently all the way around until it comes off, and then it gives you access to this what we're looking at now, which is a cotter pin. And basically you take these two ends and pull this out, and it's going to give us access to the axle nut. All right, now that we have access to the axle nut, we're going to take our big socket, put it on there. When you're trying to loosen this up, the rotor starts spinning on you. This is where the screwdriver comes into play. Put it inside the vents of the rotor and it'll stop against the caliper and give you an opportunity to loosen this guy up. All right, our axle nut is off. So now we're gonna move to the ball joint, the lower ball joint. And it's gonna be 4 17 millimeter bolts. It's 1, 2, and there's 2 on the other side. All right, now that we got the 4 lower ball joint bolts out, that all you should be able to do now is to be able to pull the spindle forward and away from the axle. If this guy's in there pretty good, you might have to give it a couple knocks with a hammer. If you don't have a hammer, maybe the back of your ratchet, or the side of your ratchet, I mean. Let's try to get this guy out. All right, like I said, you're able to just pull the spindle up and out. May take a little bit of hammering to push this through, but once you have it free, you should be able to pull the axle out of the spindle and have it rest right here on the tie rod. All right, so moving on from here, we're just going to be able to pull out the CV axle from the differential. We use our pry bar to get right behind it and pull it forward. Just note that I chose a bad spot. If you want to lift the truck, try to lift it from the middle subframe if you can, because you will be leaking differential fluid, and right now it's going to be leaking all over this jack. So put something underneath if you can, and then kind of leave it in until you're ready to swap it out with the new axle. That way you don't leak that much fluid. So you can see right here, I left the axle in there, so not so much fluid is leaking, but it is leaking a little bit here, just to show you. So I left it in there. Here is the new axle, and that's the old one from the passenger side. It's way better, much stiffer. Boots are nice. This guy's totally shot, spaghetti noodle, and so is this one. Also, the nice thing about the ones from NAPA is that they have a smaller head going into the differential, which allows you to kind of get past this small space you got between your coilover and the bump stop. Other than that, this one's, and I think I'm gonna have to hammer it out right now, which is what I had to do with that one. And once you're ready to throw this guy in, just know that there's a little C-clip right here that kind of like dances around, and as you're pushing that into the differential, you have to really hear that click and yank on it a little bit to make sure it's seating in there properly. So on that same token, this head that goes into the differential is a lot bigger than this one that I mentioned. So the way to do it is you're actually gonna have to go out that way because this portion is a lot smaller. You can fit in this tight space. Takes a little finesse, but if you rotate it enough to get the right angle, it should go right in. And that little C-clip falls in a little slot that's inside the differential and locks it in. Give it a little tug, and if it stays in there, you're good to go. Okay, now we're at the next step that we need to put the spindle back onto the axle, and then from there we'll be able to put the ball joint bolts back in. May take a little convincing, but if you can just shove the axle bolt straight through, you're good to go. Make sure you line up the holes before you go in and use an impact gun. Make sure you hand screw them in first and then use an impact gun. All right, I got the 4 bolts underneath, all torqued down. I found that it's 59 foot-pounds, so that's good to go. Now we're on to the axle nut. A little bit of a predicament on that. The aftermarket one came with a castle nut like this. I don't have a socket this size, but I did have a socket for the original, so that's what I'm gonna use. And fortunate for us, it does thread on just fine. Torque spec on this guy is 103 foot-pounds. Same idea, if this starts spinning on you, just put the screwdriver back in against the caliper. You should be able to get it torqued down. All right, with our cotter pin now in, we can just put the wheel back on, torque it to spec, and drop the vehicle down. So again, we're mimicking a trail side repair, and so with just 5 bolts we've been able to swap out the axle. So one last look at these horrible axles. Yeah, just always keep an eye on your CV boots. If they tear, they'll sling grease everywhere, and then it could cause you to have some brake failure if that grease gets on your rotors. So be careful with that, and obviously no grease really compromises your axles and could break on the trail, and that's never fun for anybody. So hope that was helpful. Again, don't forget to check out the Dirtbag Garage on Instagram and on YouTube, and also my page, Dr._Omiz on Instagram.